We must secure
December
the ridge by
19,
0600.
1944,
Agreed.
Verdun,
What about the
France.
southern flank?
The air inside the
Send the reserves there
stone-walled
immediately.
conference room smelled of damp wool and stale cigarette smoke. Outside, the winter sky hung low and gray, pressing down on the Meuse
Armored
River
division must
Valley like a
bypass
lid
this
on a
ridge
tomb.
line and secure the
General
crossroads by
George S.
0600.
Patton,
That
Jr.,
exposes their flank.
stood before a map
Risky,
of Belgium
but
and
decisive.
Luxembourg, his pearl-handled revolvers catching the weak light filtering through frost-covered windows. His breath misted in the
We must
cold.
secure the objective by 0600.
Around him sat
Mark the
officers
primary
whose
target
faces
coordinates
bore
here.
the weight of impossible
Confirmed. Moving to
mathematics.
deployment phase.
Fuel consumption rates, road capacities, ammunition expenditures, the brutal calculus of modern mechanized warfare. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower had just asked the impossible. Turn the entire Third Army 90 degrees north, disengage from its current offensive into the Saar, and relieve the besieged 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne within 72 hours. 133 miles through winter storms, over icy roads, against the flank of the largest German counteroffensive since 1940. Patton answered without hesitation, "We'll be there in 48. The room fell silent. Some thought it bravado, others madness. What none fully grasped, not even Patton himself in that frozen moment, was that this promise would require not just tactical brilliance or operational daring, but the mobilization of the most extraordinary logistical achievement in military history. An achievement so vast, so unprecedented, that German high command would refuse to believe it was happening even as their own intelligence officers reported it. An achievement built not on steel or firepower alone, but on something the Third Reich had fatally miscalculated: the industrial might, organizational genius, and sheer material abundance of American democracy. In Berlin, in the map rooms beneath the Reich Chancellery where Hitler's staff plotted their Ardennes gamble, German planners had made careful studies. They knew Patton's reputation. They knew his aggressive instincts, his tactical speed, his willingness to take risks that made more cautious commanders blanch. But they also knew the mathematics of military logistics, the iron laws that governed every modern army. A panzer division consumed roughly 30,000 gallons of fuel per day of heavy combat. An American armored division, with its profusion of vehicles, required even more. Artillery batteries fired thousands of shells in sustained bombardment. Infantry divisions needed food, medical supplies, ammunition, replacement weapons, cold weather gear. And all of it had to travel over roads that winter and war had reduced to ribbons of frozen mud and broken stone. The German calculation was elegant in its logic. Patton commanded 3 full corps, 10 divisions, nearly 250,000 men, hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles. To pivot that force 90 degrees would require disengaging from current positions, turning supply lines inside out, and establishing new axes of advance through the worst winter Western Europe had seen in decades. Weather forecasts promised continued snow and freezing rain. The roads through the Ardennes were narrow, primitive, designed for local farm traffic, not modern mechanized armies. Even if Patton attempted the maneuver, German intelligence estimated it would take 10 to 14 days before his forces could arrive in strength. By then, the German offensive would have reached the Meuse River crossings. The window for American counterattack would have closed. It was not pessimism, but mathematics. The Germans had pioneered modern mobile warfare. They understood logistics as intimately as they understood tactics. Their own supply difficulties on the Eastern Front had taught them bitter lessons about the limits of movement, the friction of distance, the way even the best plans foundered on the prosaic realities of fuel trucks and ammunition dumps. If the Wehrmacht, disciplined, experienced, fighting on interior lines, struggled with these challenges, how could the Americans, with their longer supply chains and less battle-hardened troops, possibly overcome them? What German intelligence failed to account for was not American courage or determination. German soldiers had learned to respect those qualities in North Africa and Sicily and Normandy. What they failed to comprehend, what their entire ideological framework prevented them from comprehending, was the scale of American industrial production and the sophistication of American military logistics. In the Nazi worldview, democracy was weakness, abundance was decadence, and the pluralistic society of the United States could never match the focused will of totalitarian discipline. They had spent years hearing propaganda about American softness, Jewish corruption of American purpose, the mongrel nature of American society. They believed their own mythology. The reality was being assembled, even as Hitler's panzers pushed through the snow-covered forests of Belgium, along WWII road and rail lines stretching back across France to the Channel ports. More than 6,000 trucks, not repurposed civilian vehicles or captured enemy transports, but purpose-built military cargo carriers manufactured in Detroit and Flint and Cleveland. GMC CCKW 6x6s, Studebaker US6s, Mac Nos, rolling off assembly lines at a rate the German economy had never approached even at its wartime peak. Each truck could carry 5,000 pounds of cargo. Each was maintained by trained mechanics with access to mountains of spare parts. Each was fueled by gasoline refined from Texas oil and shipped across a U-boat-haunted Atlantic in quantities that would have supplied the entire Africa Corps for a year. These trucks belonged to the Red Ball Express and its sister supply routes, the improvised but brilliantly organized transportation network that kept the Allied armies moving across France. When formal supply depots could not keep pace with the rapid advance after Normandy, American logistics officers had simply commandeered every available truck and created a loop system. Convoys ran from channel ports to forward dumps and back again. 24 hours a day, red balls painted on bumpers to indicate priority traffic, military police holding all other vehicles aside to let them pass. At its peak, the Red Ball Express moved 12,000 tons of supplies daily. Drivers, many of them African-American soldiers serving in one of the few combat-adjacent roles open to them in a still segregated army, worked shifts that violated every safety regulation, navigating blacked-out roads, catching sleep in their cabs during loading, pushing their vehicles to the edge of mechanical tolerance. It was inefficient by peacetime standards, wasteful even. Trucks wore out faster than optimal maintenance schedules recommended. Fuel consumption was astronomical, but it worked, and in war, working was all that mattered. The United States had the industrial capacity to build more trucks when old ones broke down, to ship more fuel when stocks ran low, to treat logistics not as a careful rationing of scarce resources, but as a problem that could be overwhelmed with sheer abundance. Now that system was about to be tested as never before. On December 20th, as Patton's staff worked through the night translating his promise into operational orders, the logistics officers of Third Army confronted a challenge unlike anything in military history. They needed to move 10 divisions north while simultaneously maintaining offensive operations in their current sector, because Patton refused to give the Germans any warning by pulling units out of line early. They needed to establish new supply dumps along routes their trucks had never traveled, in territory where they had no stockpiles, while winter storms reduced visibility to yards and turned roads into ice rinks. They needed to sustain rates of fuel and ammunition consumption that would spike dramatically once forces entered combat at Bastogne. And they needed to do it all without pause, because every hour of delay meant more American paratroopers dying in the encircled town. Colonel Walter J. Muller, 3rd Army's G4 logistics chief, looked at the numbers and began making phone calls. To fuel depots in Lorraine and Champagne, ordering every available tanker truck forward. To ordnance companies, demanding ammunition trucks be loaded and moving within hours. To quartermaster units, requisitioning cold weather gear, medical supplies, rations for 250,000 men. To the Red Ball Express control points, requesting every truck that could be spared from other sectors. To the Corps of Engineers, ordering bridge equipment prepped for river crossings that might or might not be needed. To field hospitals, warning them to expect massive casualty flows within days. The response was not hesitation but implementation. This was what American military logistics had been designed to do, not to carefully husband limited resources, but to surge, to overwhelm problems with material, to turn industrial capacity into operational tempo. Within hours, convoys were forming. Trucks that had been running supplies to units in the SAR were redirected north. Fuel dumps in rear areas began transferring their stocks forward in mobile tanker trucks that would follow the advancing columns. Artillery ammunition, tens of thousands of shells weighing tons each, was loaded onto trucks already groaning with previous cargo. German intelligence began reporting unusual American truck movements on December 20th, but the reports made no sense. The movements seemed random, scattered across too wide a front to indicate a coherent plan. Some German officers suggested the Americans were simply repositioning supplies in response to the Ardennes offensive, perhaps preparing to defend against a wider German advance. The idea that these movements represented preparation for an offensive, a 90-degree pivot by an entire army, was con. Cidered and dismissed, the numbers did not work, no army could move that fast. They were about to learn otherwise. On the morning of December 22nd, the 4th Armored Division, Patton's spearhead for the Relief of Bastogne, began rolling north. Behind it came the 80th and 26th Infantry Divisions, then the rest of III Corps, then XII Corps, a steel river flowing through the winter landscape. And feeding that river, sustaining it, keeping it moving when every military precedent said it should have ground to a halt, came the trucks. Convoy after convoy, headlights blacked out, drivers navigating by instinct and moonlight when it broke through the clouds. GMC 6x6s loaded with 5-gallon jerry cans of gasoline, enough fuel in a single convoy to fill the tanks of an entire armored battalion. Studebakers hauling wooden crates of 75 armor-piercing rounds, 105 high-explosive shells, .50 caliber machine gun ammunition in belts 6 feet long. Mack trucks carrying ration boxes, C rations and K rations and D rations, millions of calories in cans and waxed cardboard, bland and monotonous but sufficient to keep men fighting in sub-zero temperatures. Medical supply trucks with plasma and morphine and surgical equipment. Signal Corps trucks with radio sets and telephone wire. Ordnance trucks with replacement tank tracks, spare machine gun barrels, crates of grenades. The scale beggared comprehension. In a single 24-hour period, 3rd Army logistics units moved more than 5,000 tons of supplies forward. That was more than the entire British Expeditionary Force had consumed per day during the Battle of France in 1940. It was more than German Army Group Center used in many days of its advance into Russia. And it was sustained not for a day or two, but for weeks, through some of the worst weather conditions imaginable, over road networks that were barely adequate in peacetime. German forward observers, watching from their positions as Patton's divisions wheeled north, could not understand what they were seeing. Entire American divisions appeared where German maps showed empty roads 24 hours earlier. Fuel trucks rolled forward even under artillery fire, drivers hunched over steering wheels, determined to reach the forward dumps. Ammunition convoys bypassed units still unloading to get supplies to units already in contact with the enemy. It violated everything the Germans understood about military logistics. The careful scheduling, the precise allocation of resources, the inevitable delays as supply officers verified inventories and signed requisition forms. What the Germans were witnessing, though they lacked the conceptual framework to interpret it, was logistics as practiced by an economy of abundance. American military doctrine did not rely on precision because American industry could afford redundancy. If a truck broke down, another truck would arrive within hours. If an ammunition dump was shelled, another dump could be established overnight. If fuel consumption exceeded estimates, more tankers would be dispatched. The United States was not managing scarcity. It was deploying surplus. And that surplus, that material abundance born of an industrial economy the world had never seen before, was being translated directly into operational tempo. By December 26th, just 7 days after Eisenhower's meeting at Verdun, lead elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division reached the perimeter of Bastogne. The siege was broken. German commanders, reading the reports, felt the first cold touch of understanding. They had expected 10 to 14 days. Patton had delivered in 7. How? The answer was rolling along every road behind the American lines. More than 6,000 trucks, operating in shifts, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, sustaining a rate of advance that consumed fuel and ammunition at rates that would have bankrupted any other military logistics system in the world. American truck drivers, many of whom would never receive medals or public recognition, who slept 3 hours a night and drove through artillery barrages and kept their vehicles moving through ice storms and mechanical failures, were rewriting the operational possibilities of modern war. German soldiers, pulled back from their positions to avoid encirclement as Patton's forces drove deeper into the Ardennes salient, remembered what they had been told about American industrial capacity. They had heard it in training, read it in intelligence summaries, seen it in the endless bomber streams that had reduced German cities to rubble. But hearing about American production statistics and experiencing the reality of American logistics were different things. The numbers, 10,000 tanks a year, 50,000 aircraft, hundreds of thousands of trucks, had seemed abstract, propaganda perhaps, or exaggerations meant to demoralize. Now those numbers had physical form. They were the unending convoys on every road, the AM. Munition that kept falling even after days of continuous bombardment. The fuel trucks that arrived like clockwork to forward positions. A German lieutenant, captured near Bastogne in early January, told his interrogators something that would appear in American intelligence summaries. "We could destroy your tanks, kill your infantry, blow up your bridges. But the next morning there would be more tanks, more infantry, new bridges, and always more trucks. It was like fighting the ocean. You could push back one wave, but another was already coming, and another behind that, and you knew there would never be an end to the waves." It was the economics of total war, and it terrified soldiers who had been raised on the myth of the superior will. Nazi ideology had taught them that strength came from discipline, from racial purity, from the focused purpose of the authoritarian state. Abundance was spiritual weakness, the decadence of democracies too soft to make hard choices, too corrupted by materialism to sustain martial virtue. Yet here was material abundance defeating martial virtue through the simple expedient of having more of everything. More fuel than German tanks could burn, more ammunition than German artillery could fire, more replacement vehicles than German mechanics could repair. Democracy, it turned out, could produce. The trucks became a symbol, appearing in the background of every German soldier's experience of the Ardennes defeat. They were there when German units tried to retreat and found American forces had cut off their withdrawal routes overnight. Forces that could not have moved that quickly without the fuel trucks that kept pace with their advance. They were there when German artillery positions were overrun because they had expended their limited ammunition stocks, while American counter-battery fire never seemed to diminish. They were there in the prison compounds where captured German soldiers saw row after row of American vehicles. new ones arriving daily to replace losses, each one testament to an industrial capacity the Third Reich could never match. One recurring image appeared in German prisoner interrogations, in letters home that were intercepted by censors, in the diaries of soldiers who survived. The nighttime convoy, headlights blacked out but visible by moonlight on snow, stretching back along the roads until it disappeared into darkness. There was no beginning or end to it, just an endless stream of vehicles, each one carrying tons of supplies forward. Some German soldiers estimated the convoys at hundreds of trucks. Some said thousands. The numbers were probably exaggerated, but the impression was accurate. The Red Ball Express and its sister supply routes had no true end. When one convoy delivered its cargo and turned around, another was already forming behind it. The system was circular, self-sustaining, feeding on itself, limited only by the number of trucks available, and the United States was building more trucks every day. Patton himself understood what was happening, though he expressed it in his own characteristic style. In his diary, he wrote, "A good solution applied with vigor now is better than a perfect solution 10 minutes later. But a good solution only works if you have the means to apply it. We have the means. We have more means than any army in history. Every soldier we have is backed by a ton of supplies, 100 gallons of gasoline, 1,000 rounds of ammunition. The Germans are brave. They are skilled. But they are poor, and poverty loses wars." It was a brutal calculus, but not inaccurate. The German military in late 1944 was starving, not for food necessarily, but for every resource modern warfare required. Fuel was so scarce that German armor units husbanded every liter, planning operations around the assumption that no resupply would arrive. Ammunition was rationed carefully, with artillery batteries limited to a few dozen shells per day unless a major attack justified expending stockpiles. Replacement vehicles were scarce. Tanks lost in combat often sat abandoned because no recovery vehicles were available to tow them to repair depots. The Ardennes offensive itself had been planned partly on the assumption that German forces would capture American fuel dumps. They needed enemy supplies to sustain their own operation. Against this scarcity, the Americans deployed surplus. Not just enough, but more than enough. Enough that if a supply convoy was ambushed and destroyed, operations would continue uninterrupted. Enough that ammunition could be expended freely, that tanks could be abandoned if they broke down because replacement tanks were available, that entire supply dumps could be moved overnight if tactical situations changed. The American military operated with what logistics officers called redundancy, but what was really a safety margin born of abundance. This abundance had costs. It required a merchant marine fleet of thousands of ships to carry supplies across the Atlantic. It required rail networks in Britain and France running at maximum capacity. It required fuel refineries operating around the clock, steel mills producing at rates that wore out equipment, rubber plantations in Southeast Asia being pushed to their limits to provide tires for all those trucks. It required the labor of millions of American workers, many of them women who had entered the industrial workforce for the first time, building vehicles and weapons and ammunition at wages that gave them purchasing power even as they funded military production. In other words, it required exactly the kind of society Nazi ideology despised. A pluralistic democracy with a consumer economy, where workers had rights and wages, where government mobilized industry through contracts and incentives rather than decrees, where production decisions were made by engineers and managers rather than party officials. The very inefficiency of democratic capitalism, its apparent waste, its redundancy, its surplus capacity, was being weaponized. All those unnecessary, consumer goods factories that had made America seem soft and materialistic in the 1930s had converted to military production with remarkable speed. All those inefficient, Civilian truck manufacturers were now building standardized military vehicles at rates Germany's centrally planned economy could not approach. There was bitter irony in this for German soldiers who had been indoctrinated in Nazi racial theories. Many had been taught that Slavs were subhuman, incapable of sustaining industrial civilization, yet Russian factories beyond the Urals had produced the T-34s that were crushing the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. They had been taught that Jews corrupted and weakened societies, yet many of the scientists and engineers who designed American weapons and industrial processes were Jewish refugees from Hitler's Europe. They had been taught that American society was mongrel and degenerate, yet here was that mongrel society producing more war material than all of fascist Europe combined. The trucks rolling through the Ardennes were not just military vehicles. They were proof that Nazi ideology was wrong at its foundation. Democratic societies could be productive. Mixed populations could be organized effectively. Free economies could outproduce command economies. And all the racial mythology, all the claims of Aryan superiority and authoritarian efficiency could not conjure up a single additional ton of supplies when the warehouses were empty. Some German officers grasped this. Colonel Hans von Luck, a veteran panzer commander, would later write, "We had been told that Americans were soft, that they cared more for comfort than victory, that they would break when faced with determined resistance. Instead, we found an army that had brought its comfort with it. They did not choose between fighting and good supply. They had both. And that, we slowly realized, was the point. A democracy at war does not ask its soldiers to suffer unnecessarily. It gives them what they need to win, and then it gives them more because it can afford to. We could not match that. We could only watch those trucks roll past and know that we were fighting not just an army but an entire industrial civilization." The trucks themselves were unremarkable machines individually. The GMC CCKW, the iconic Jimmy or Deuce and a half of American military lore, was a 2.5-ton cargo truck with a 6-cylinder engine, 4-wheel drive, and a reputation for reliability. It was not particularly fast, topping out at around 50 miles per hour on good roads. It was not comfortable. Drivers sat in a cab that offered minimal protection from weather, steering a vehicle with no power assistance, operating a clutch that left legs aching after hours of shifting. It was not sophisticated. The technology was proven, even conservative, prioritizing ease of production and field maintenance over advanced features. But there were so many of them. GMC alone produced more than 560,000 CCKW trucks during the war. Add in Studebaker, Chevrolet, Mack, International Harvester, and other manufacturers, and American industry built well over 2 million military trucks between 1940 and 1945. By comparison, Germany produced roughly 350,000 military trucks during the entire war, and many of those were converted civilian vehicles lacking 4-wheel drive or other essential features for military use. The Soviet Union, recipient of massive American Lend-Lease aid, received more than 400,000 American-made trucks, more than Germany's entire domestic production. This disparity was not accidental. It reflected fundamental differences in industrial philosophy and economic structure. American manufacturing had pioneered mass production techniques, interchangeable parts, assembly line construction, standardized designs that allowed rapid scaling of output. When Ford and GM converted from civilian auto production to military vehicle production, they brought decades of efficiency innovations with them. German industry, by contrast, had traditionally emphasized craftsmanship and customization. German trucks came in dozens of variants from different manufacturers, with minimal parts interchangeability. This made logistics a nightmare. A maintenance unit supporting German forces needed to stock parts for Opel, Mercedes, and MAN trucks, along with various captured French, Czech, and Russian vehicles pressed into service. American maintenance units stocked parts for GMC trucks, because that's mostly what they had. The American approach was dismissed by some as wasteful, as sacrificing quality for quantity. And it was true that individual German vehicles were often superior in specific ways: better engines, more refined engineering, more attention to detail. But wars are not won by individual vehicles. They are won by logistics systems, by the ability to keep large forces supplied over extended periods. And for that, quantity mattered more than quality. A GMC truck that was only 80% as capable as a German equivalent, but which could be produced in 5 times the numbers, maintained with readily available parts, and replaced quickly when destroyed, was more valuable in operational terms. The drivers of these trucks came from every corner of American society. Farm boys from Iowa who knew how to coax temperamental machinery through another day's work. Factory workers from Detroit who understood engines and transmissions. Teenagers fresh out of high school, learning skills that would serve them in civilian life after the war. And in disproportionate numbers, African American soldiers. Nearly 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were black, serving in one of the few military roles fully open to them in a still segregated force. These men worked under conditions that would have been considered unbearable in peacetime. 18-hour shifts were common during critical operations like the Relief of Bastogne. Drivers navigated blacked-out roads at night, prohibited from using headlights that might attract German aircraft or artillery. They drove through combat zones, sometimes arriving at forward supply points while firefights were still ongoing nearby. They endured winter cold that turned unheated truck cabs into ice boxes, summer heat that left them exhausted and dehydrated. They faced mechanical breakdowns on deserted roads, where helping another driver could mean the difference between completing the mission and becoming stranded. They dealt with the constant low-grade fear of ambush, of rolling around a curve and finding a German roadblock, of being strafed by a fighter that had slipped through Allied air cover. And they kept driving, because they understood, better than many who would later write histories of the war, that their cargo meant life or death for soldiers at the front. A convoy delayed meant infantry units running low on ammunition, tank battalions unable to advance for lack of fuel, artillery batteries rationing shells, while German forces prepared counterattacks. The drivers did not think of themselves as heroes. They were truck drivers, doing the unglamorous work that kept armies functioning. But they were part of something unprecedented in military history. Why? A logistics system that turned industrial capacity directly into combat power, that made operational tempo a function of production capacity, that demonstrated how democratic societies could mobilize resources in ways authoritarian systems could not match. By January 1945, as Third Army continued to compress the Ardennes salient and drive German forces back to their start lines, the full scope of the American logistics achievement became clear. In 1 month of winter combat, Third Army had consumed more than 60 million gallons of fuel, fired more than 4 million artillery shells, and sustained operations across a front hundreds of miles wide. This would have been impossible for any other military force in the world. The Red Army, despite its massive size, could not have sustained those consumption rates over that duration. Soviet logistics depended heavily on American-supplied trucks and on railways that German forces had destroyed in their retreat. The British, with their more limited industrial base, carefully rationed ammunition and fuel. The Germans, fighting on inner lines with theoretically shorter supply routes, were starving for resources. Only the Americans could do this. Only an economy that produced nearly half the world's industrial output, only a society wealthy enough to feed its armies with variety and abundance, Only a nation that could build thousands of ships and tens of thousands of aircraft while simultaneously producing millions of trucks could sustain these operational tempos. The trucks were not just vehicles. They were the physical manifestation of American industrial might, the weapon that German planners had underestimated because it did not kill directly, because it seemed prosaic and unheroic, because Nazi ideology had no category for the strategic power of logistics. There is a photograph, widely circulated after the war, showing a section of road in the Ardennes in late December 1944. The road curves through snow-covered forest, and on it are trucks, dozens of them visible in the frame, with more implied beyond the edges of the image. They are moving in both directions, empty trucks returning from forward dumps heading south, loaded trucks moving north toward the front. The photo was taken from a hillside vantage point, and the trucks stretch away until they become too small to distinguish individually, merging into a line that suggests infinity. German soldiers who saw similar scenes remembered them decades later. They remembered the sound, the grinding of gears, the diesel engines, the particular rhythm of heavy-laden trucks navigating poor roads. They remembered the ubiquity, how American trucks appeared everywhere, even in places German forces thought secure, even in conditions when German vehicles could not operate. They remembered the abundance, how trucks would be abandoned if they broke down, because it was faster to bring up a replacement than to repair the disabled vehicle in place. They remembered the implications, that they were fighting an enemy who had so much of everything that waste was affordable, that redundancy was standard, that the normal constraints of military logistics simply did not apply. This was the symbolic weight the trucks carried. They represented a form of power that Axis ideology could not comprehend. Nazi philosophy taught that will triumphed over materiel, that spiritual strength mattered more than economic production, that a racially pure and ideologically committed nation could overcome material disadvantages through superior fighting spirit. Japanese militarism taught similar lessons, that Bushido and emperor worship gave Japanese forces advantages that decadent Western societies could never match. Both ideologies dismissed American industrial capacity as irrelevant or actually harmful. Surely a society focused on material comfort and consumer goods could not produce effective warriors. The trucks proved them wrong. They proved that abundance was a strength, not a weakness. That industrial capacity could be converted to military power with devastating effectiveness. That a society of consumers could, when necessary, become a society of producers. That democracy and industrial efficiency were not contradictions, but complements. That free workers with good wages produced more than slave laborers working under threat. That the very materialism Axis propaganda mocked was, in fact, a strategic advantage of the highest order. There were costs to this approach that would not become fully apparent until after the war. The environmental impact of millions of vehicles consuming billions of gallons of fuel. The resource extraction required to feed American industry, bauxite from South America, rubber from plantations worked under colonial conditions in Asia, iron ore from Minnesota's Mesabi Range. The way American abundance depended on a global empire of resources, even if America did not think of itself as an imperial power. The social costs of rapid industrialization, the workers injured in factories running at unsustainable speeds, the communities disrupted by massive population movements to industrial centers. But in the winter of 1944-45, these costs were invisible or considered necessary. What mattered was that American logistics worked, that Patton's impossible promise had been kept, that the siege of Bastogne had been broken in a week when German planners expected to, that the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble in the West, had been defeated not just through courage or tactical skill, but through the systematic application of material superiority. When Third Army liberated the surrounded paratroopers at Bastogne, the first question many asked was not about the fighting but about supplies. When would hot food arrive? When would ammunition be resupplied? When would the wounded be evacuated? The answers came within hours. Trucks rolled into Bastogne on December 26th, even as fighting continued on the perimeter. Hot rations were distributed. Ammunition was unloaded under fire. Medical vehicles took on wounded for evacuation to field hospitals that had themselves moved north with the advancing forces. The same logistics system that had enabled Patton's relief also sustained it, turning the narrow corridor into Bastogne into a pipeline of supplies. German forces surrounding Bastogne, watching this unfold, understood that the battle was lost. Not because they lacked courage or skill. German forces continued to fight with desperation born of knowledge that defeat meant the end. But because they were now cut off from their own supply lines while facing an enemy who could bring up reinforcements and supplies at will. They were fighting not just Third Army, but the industrial capacity of the United States. And that was a fight no amount of tactical expertise could win. In the weeks that followed, as winter turned to spring and Allied forces prepared for the final offensives into Germany, the trucks continued their work. They hauled supplies for the crossing of the Rhine. They supported the drive into the Ruhr. They kept pace with armored columns advancing so rapidly that they sometimes outran their own supply lines, and then were resupplied by airdrops and emergency convoys that would have been impossible without the massive transportation infrastructure the United States had built. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, American military logistics had achieved something unprecedented. They had sustained multi-front operations over 2 oceans for 4 years, supplied not just American forces, but Allied armies through Lend-Lease, and maintained consumption rates that dwarfed anything attempted by any military in history. And at the center of this achievement were trucks, millions of them, operating on every continent where the war was fought, turning industrial production into combat power, making strategy a function of capacity. The veterans who drove those trucks would return home to a changed America. The skills they learned, driving, maintenance, logistics management, would prove valuable in civilian life. Many would enter the trucking industry, which expanded dramatically in the post-war decades. Some would become warehouse managers, supply chain specialists, the invisible infrastructure that kept American abundance flowing. They would remember the war not as a series of heroic moments, but as endless hours behind a wheel, navigating dark roads, delivering cargo that someone else would use. They would remember being part of something larger than themselves, part of a logistics system that demonstrated what American industry could achieve when fully mobilized. But they would also remember something else, the look on German prisoners' faces when they saw the convoys, the mixture of disbelief and resignation, the moment when ideology met reality and shattered. These German soldiers had been told their entire lives that they represented the apex of human civilization, that their discipline and will made them superior to the decadent democracies. And then they had watched those democracies bury them in materiel, had seen abundance deployed as a weapon, had learned that industrial capacity was a form of power their ideology had no answer for. One prisoner, a young Waffen-SS soldier captured in the Ardennes, told his interrogator, "We were told that National Socialism made us strong, that it gave us advantages the Americans could never have. But you have the advantage of wealth. You can afford to waste what we must husband. You can replace what we must repair. You can feed your soldiers 3 meals a day while ours go hungry. This is not the superiority we were promised, but it is superiority nonetheless." It was an honest assessment. The United States had won the logistics war not through superior planning or more efficient organization, though American logistics was remarkably effective, but through sheer abundance. The same abundance that had made America seem soft and materialistic in the 1930s had proven to be a decisive strategic advantage. A society rich enough to give its citizens automobiles and consumer goods in peacetime could, in wartime, give its soldiers trucks and ammunition in quantities that overwhelmed enemies. The connection between peacetime prosperity and wartime capability was direct. The factories that built civilian trucks could build military trucks. The mechanics who serviced civilian vehicles could service military vehicles. The infrastructure that supported American consumerism, roads, ports, railways, oil refineries, could support military logistics. This was the deeper lesson of those 6,000 trucks running 24 hours a day through the Ardennes winter. They represented not just American tactical success, but American strategic vision. The understanding that wars between industrial nations would be won by economics as much as by combat. That abundance could be weaponized. That the productive capacity of free societies was a military advantage of the highest order. German prisoners who spent the last months of the war in American POW camps encountered this reality in another form. They were fed 3 meals a day, not luxurious meals, but adequate, more than many German civilians were receiving. They had medical care. They worked in labor details that were, by the standards of Eastern Front combat, absurdly safe and comfortable. They received mail from home and could send letters back. They saw American military bases with their supplies stacked in warehouses, with motor pools full of vehicles, with post exchanges selling cigarettes and candy and magazines to soldiers as if there was no war on. Many found it difficult to reconcile this with the propaganda they had been fed. American society was supposed to be on the verge of collapse, torn apart by class warfare and racial strife, its Jewish elite bleeding the nation dry. Instead, they saw a society so wealthy that even its prisoners were comfortable, so productive that it could spare resources for things beyond immediate survival. Some dismissed this as anomaly or illusion. Others began to question what they had been told. The trucks were part of this questioning, because trucks, unlike tanks or aircraft, were utilitarian. They had no glamour, no mystique. They were tools, nothing more. Yet America had built millions of them, had created an entire logistics infrastructure around them, had turned them into strategic weapons through sheer quantity. If America could do that with something as mundane as trucks, what else were German soldiers wrong about? What else had Nazi ideology hidden from them? There were no easy answers to these questions. Many German soldiers would spend the rest of their lives wrestling with the gap between what they had believed and what they had experienced. But the trucks remained in memory. The endless convoys, the steady flow of supplies, the physical evidence that American society was organized in ways Nazi ideology could not explain and could not counter. The trucks became symbolic of the larger defeat, not just military but ideological, not just tactical but philosophical. In the final accounting, Patton's Relief of Bastogne was made possible not primarily by tactical brilliance, though Patton's aggressive leadership mattered, but by logistics, by the trucks that moved 10 divisions 90 degrees in a week, by the supply system that sustained offensive operations in winter conditions, by the industrial capacity that treated the massive consumption of fuel and ammunition as a manageable problem rather than an impossible burden. German intelligence had predicted 10 days. Patton delivered in 7, and the difference was trucks. Thousands of them, driven by soldiers whose names appeared in no headlines, whose contributions would be forgotten by all but their families, but who had helped win a war. As the spring of 1945 turned to summer and the war in Europe ended, many of those trucks were shipped to the Pacific for the invasion of Japan. An invasion that would never occur because American industrial might had also built atomic weapons. Some trucks remained in Europe, used by occupation forces. Many were simply abandoned, left to rust in fields and forests, too expensive to ship home, their strategic value exhausted. Within years, they would be scavenged for parts, purchased by European farmers, repurposed for civilian use. The machines themselves were mortal. But what they represented endured. They had proved that abundance was power, that industrial democracy could outproduce authoritarian efficiency, that the soft, materialistic society of Nazi propaganda was capable of organizing the most sophisticated logistics system in military history. They had shown German soldiers, and through them, the broader world, that American strength was not illusion or propaganda, but the physical reality of trucks and fuel and ammunition flow. NG forward without pause, without limit, until the enemy broke. There is a final image worth preserving. A road in Germany in May 1945 after the surrender. An American supply convoy is moving through a town, and German civilians have come out to watch. Among them are former soldiers released from hastily disbanded units, still wearing parts of their uniforms. They stand at the roadside, watching the trucks roll past. The trucks are not celebrating. They are working, moving supplies for occupation forces, continuing the mission. But their presence is message enough. They are still there, still moving, still supplied, still abundant. And in the watching faces of the former German soldiers, men who had expected to win through will and discipline and racial superiority, there is understanding. Perhaps not acceptance, not yet, but recognition. Recognition that they had been wrong about what made nations strong. That abundance was not decadence, but capacity. That democracy could organize, could produce, could win. That the material world mattered, and mastery of it required not ideology, but industry. That 6,000 trucks running 24 hours a day were worth more than 100 speeches about will and destiny. The war had been decided by many factors: strategy, tactics, intelligence, leadership, courage, sacrifice. But underneath all of it, enabling all of it, was logistics. And American logistics, symbolized by those endless convoys of trucks, had proven superior not because Americans were better planners or more efficient managers, but because American society had more. More resources, more industrial capacity, more trucks, more fuel, more everything. And when everything else was equal, more was enough. Patton had promised to be in Bastogne in 48 hours. He made it in 7 days, which German planners had thought impossible. The difference, the factor that German intelligence had fatally underestimated, was not Patton's genius but American capacity. The capacity to build 6,000 trucks, the capacity to run them continuously, the capacity to turn industrial production into operational tempo. The capacity that democracy, for all its apparent inefficiencies and contradictions, had proven it possessed in greater measure than any authoritarian state could match. That was the lesson of the Ardennes winter. That was what the trucks represented. And that was why, decades after the last convoy rolled through, the image of those endless lines of vehicles remained in memory, testament to the moment when abundance, deployed with purpose, proved stronger than will.